Hello. So the title of our talk is Who Are You? Who are we? Who are we? So I thought we'd start by saying a little bit of something about who we actually are. So I'm Dr. Ash Ranpura. I do both neurology and neuroscience. So the difference is that as a neurologist, I see patients clinically, with neurological disorders like strokes and seizures and multiple sclerosis. And as a neuroscientist, I research brain function. Mainly, my background has to do with some with brain imaging.
So I'm Gelong Thubten. Gelong means monk, so my name's Thubten, and as you can see, I'm a monk. And I'm a Tibetan Buddhist monk, and I am based at a monastery called Samye Ling, and I run meditation centers, and I meditate, and I try to teach other people how to meditate.
So I thought what we would do this morning is we're going to divide our talk into three sort of sections. Each one is going to be about 20 minutes, and then and we're going to do some interactive exercises with you in each section. So we'll start out talking, I think, about meditation. You're pretty qualified to talk about that. We'll do that. And then we're going to move into a lighthearted discussion about the nature of the self and reality. And then we'll talk about compassion towards the end. So, Thubten and I have been working together, I guess, three years now. Yeah. And it's been very interesting because I think that for a long time in the history of neuroscience, which is a very short history compared to the history of your people, but there's been this love affair between neuroscientists and Buddhists. And I think often people see, the two of us doing an event, and they think we have really, really different perspectives, But actually, I think we're both really interested in the mechanics of mental life.
Yeah.
Like, what is it that makes this experience work? What are the levers that drive it? And so I think that, but I suppose there's a difference in approach. So I look at this mental life. I look at how to explore this thing from the outside in. We use experiments, we use EEG, we use functional neuroimaging. But I think you're doing the same sort of exploration, right, from the inside out.
Yeah, so Buddhism is it's not really a belief system as much as an investigation. It's an investigation of consciousness. And traditionally, Buddhism was always called the science of mind, or the science of awareness. So there's a sense of looking within and trying to understand what is the mind, and what is the nature of reality, and how can you make changes in your thought processes.
And I think it's interesting that, look, the process of experimentation that we now say modern science has this process of empirical experimentation. Yeah. I think for those of us who are scientists in the room, we know that it's not always like that. Like, there's a contemplative part as well. So when you think about the discovery of relativity with Einstein, or Newton's discovery of the laws of gravity, there's a big part of the scientific process which is contemplative. And so I guess in the one sense, when we talk about meditation, I guess it's useful to science in that you get a kind of a calm mind. You can get focused.
Yeah, the calmness is definitely part of it, but I think it's then about going further. I think nowadays many people are meditating. It's becoming very popular. And it tends to be seen as like a relaxation therapy. Yeah. Almost like having a massage. Yeah. And so you feel more calm and more happy. That's part of it, of course, but there's so much more to it. The calmness is to get you into a state where you can then start to investigate. So it's about going beyond calmness into insight.
Yeah.
And the training has many, many steps. Rather than just being a quick fix relaxation therapy, it's a whole shift in how you view the world.
Okay, so so what's the basics? What are the steps?
So you would start with learning how to have a different relationship with your own thoughts. That's the key, because generally we tend to be very, very controlled by our thoughts and emotions. Meditation is not anti-thought. Right. So it's not about getting rid of your thoughts, but it's about learning to have more choice. So you would use techniques involving focusing, usually. So focusing on your breathing, for example. You would maybe feel the ground under your feet, be aware of your breathing, using one of your senses. Yeah. And the whole point is that you are bringing your attention there, and when your mind wanders, you're bringing it back. And that reconnection again and again is what changes the dynamic of your thoughts.
But I think it's interesting because when you talk about this thing about using sensation to draw you back from, like, I guess, rumination.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, that's interesting already because, in the brain, there are two different systems that do rumination and what I would call interoception. So the parts of the brain that let you ruminate. Typically, I think of like the default mode network, these medial structures that are involved with self-talk or self-awareness. Those parts of the brain, they're not active at the same time as the parts of your brain that do bodily sensation. And I don't mean like the sensation of your skin. I mean introspection.
Yeah.
So how is it that we feel on the inside? And that's when you use this lever of the breath.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And that's what I think is really interesting about this overlap, that you have these practical methods. I have a lot of very theoretical ones. But I mean, there is a difference between those two brain regions, and I think they compete with each other.
Yeah, so it really is, it's a practical experiential training, which you would do in sessions. It's a little bit like going to the gym where you actually do a session of meditation. I mean, we could try this right now, very simply.
Shall we try? Is everyone, okay.
We could simply try this focusing technique, and you'll discover it's actually quite difficult in that you're trying to focus on your breath, and the mind does about 5,000 other things. But let's just try it. So it's.
I'm going to warn you. This is like the second time I've ever done it, and both previous times have been absolute catastrophes.
No, they haven't.
All right. So what do we have to do?
So you want to sit up kind of straight. There's a sense of balance in the posture, and so you're sitting up straight. You're not really kind of slouching or leaning back too much, and just be present with your body. Bring your attention into your body. Literally feel the chair under you. Feel the ground under your feet. Bring your focus into how and where you are sitting. Try to now shift focus to your hands and experience the feeling of the texture of the clothing that your hands are touching. So your hands are on your legs, and you can feel the texture of your clothing under your skin. Just notice that contact. Now bring your attention more internally and focus on your breathing. Don't breathe deeply or in any kind of special way, just normal breathing, but feel the breathing. Feel how your body is moving, a little bit of expansion and contraction with each breath, and focus on that. When your mind wanders, bring it back to the breath. Keep returning when your mind gets distracted. Okay, stop there. Very quick, but it just gives you a taste of that process of focusing. Getting lost a lot of thoughts, and then coming back.
Yeah, but I might be the only one in here. There was no moment in there when I felt my mind was quiet.
A lot of thoughts. Was there any moment when you could just remember to breathe?
You and I have tried this together 3 times now, and one of the problems that happens is I become so interested in what's actually going on in my brain.
The thoughts become really interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think it's about learning just to not get so involved and instead change focus. There's actually 3 things going on. In that very simple session, we were doing 3 things again and again. There are 3 phases in the meditation. There's the time when you're with the breath. You're focused on your breath. That's what everyone thinks meditation is, but there are actually 2 other parts as well. There's that time when you notice that you're thinking. It's the difference between being lost in thought and knowing you're thinking. So you're focusing on your breath, that's phase 1. Phase 2 is where you realize you got lost and you're back. You've noticed, your awareness is back. That's also meditation. Then phase 3 is the returning to the breath. That's also meditation. All 3 elements have value, and the session is a mixture of all 3. So that's really what's going on. But then I'm interested to hear from your point of view what's going on with meditation. You've done a lot of research into the neuroimaging of this. So how does that look?
I mean, it's interesting because the feeling of doing it is I think you're using the breath as an anchor, and I think you are activating brain structures like insular cortex, secondary somatosensory cortices, and that's pulling attention away. So the main part of your brain that neuroscientists often say is associated with self-talk. So the part of my brain that's thinking, it's so interesting what's happening in my brain, right? That part of your brain is a series of structures kind of right in the middle of your head. If you imagine a sort of a slice through the middle of your head, these midline structures are called the default mode network. It's like the posterior cingulate and medial parietal cortexes. So these parts of the brain are involved in that self-talk that we're always hearing. And then when you do this shift, so you said, okay, so phase 1 you said was with the breath. I think that's probably insular cortex. You're kind of largely noticing the internal sensations. But it's the key thing, I think, is the state, what you call phase 2.
The noticing.
Noticing. So what happens when you notice? You start activating a part of the frontal lobes out to the side. This is called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's one of my favorite brain regions, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But it's not the noticing that strengthens connectivity with dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. It's actually the noticing again and again and again. And as I said, the first time I did this with Thubten, again, it's very difficult. It seems so simple. It's shocking how difficult it is. But you said a really helpful thing to me, which was you should feel glad every time you come back. Don't feel that you've failed because your mind wandered. Feel that you've succeeded because you noticed.
Yeah, I do think it's the returning that makes you stronger. And if you think about it that way, if returning is the key, you've got to have somewhere to return from. So those thoughts aided the meditation instead of harmed it. And a lot of people who meditate feel angry with their thoughts. I'm thinking I'm a failure. Actually, the thoughts enabled the process. It's the returning that counts.
Yeah, exactly. I think we have that sort of attitude to a lot of things that we try and they're difficult. So many things. Like if I try to, I've been trying to exercise more. So what happens is that even if I do a little bit, I kind of think, I should have done more. So generally, we're sort of in this loop where we beat ourselves up.
Exactly.
And I think the key thing, for me, it was really helpful to just think it's actually the distraction that is noticing the distraction is the success. So that's a really important metric.
So that's the kind of groundwork of meditation, and one would be training like that for months, years even, just learning how to stabilize the mind, learning how to be less confused by all the thoughts and emotions, learning to have that clarity. But then, of course, it's about going deeper. I think it's important to know that there's a whole journey ahead of that, not just about calming down, but about investigating, well, who am I? What is this mind? What are these thoughts? And looking internally at the mind and trying to understand it better. What is a thought? What is consciousness?
And so now we're kind of coming to, and you've said this before, that the purpose of meditation is not just
to feel better.
It's actually to understand the nature of reality.
To understand kind of who you are. What is this? Who am I?
Right. Okay. So, so who are you? So let's say, okay. We have experimental methods that we use to address. I can tell you about some interesting experiments that address the sense of self, the sense of agency, how we understand. I'm not going to use the word. Not necessarily. We're not necessarily going to talk about consciousness. But neuroscience has techniques that we use to explore these, what I guess you could call metaphysical questions. But
Yeah.
so what's your technique?
So there is a sense of asking questions and looking deeper. So a very classic Buddhist meditation is to investigate the nature of the self. Does this self exist? What is this self? Well, where is it? That's the question. Try to track it down, tracking down the self. So an initial stage would be to ask yourself, well, am I my body? Is myself my body? Is it in my body? So then you would, in fact, dissect that. You would learn to sort of, okay, you'd think, well, if I chop my arm off, is myself diminished by that amount? Or, I mean, this is quite revolting, but go with me on this. If you were to chop my entire body up into pieces and spread them across town, where is Thubten now when the bits are separated? Is the self now in many places? So then we would say, well, no, the self isn't the body. So is the self the thoughts? I mean, we tend to relate to ourselves as how we think and how we feel. So then you would investigate the thoughts. You would look at a thought and say, okay, is this real? I feel as if my thoughts and emotions are real. I react to them all the time, but really, what are they? So you would then look directly at the thought and say, well, does it have a location? Where is it? Where does it come from? Where is it and where does it go? And does it have a shape? Is it in me? How is it functioning? So then you would realize, or you would come to the understanding, well, the thoughts aren't really solid either. So then what about the part of you that's looking at the thoughts? There seems to be a sort of observer, the awareness. So is that who we are? Are we the observer of our thoughts? So then you investigate that, and you would then look at the observer. Well, now you've got an observer looking at the observer, so then there can be another observer looking at the observer of the observer. And where does it stop? So you wouldn't find the kind of back observer. And so this is the Buddhist understanding of the illusory nature of reality.
Yeah, and I think, in neurology, I'll say as a physician, we encounter this usually in patients with neurological disorders. So for example, it's one of the most interesting disorders is schizophrenia. So in schizophrenia, there's a disordered understanding of the self. One of the ideas of why schizophrenics can sometimes, hear voices or hear what's called a command hallucination. So they hear voices telling them to do things, but they don't recognize that the voice is generated by their own mind. They attribute the voice to someone else. So they have a disordered sense of self and other. I mean, there are other disorders, like some of you may have heard of a phantom limb disorder, so when you have a limb amputee who imagines there's a part of the body there that's not there. There's also dissociative disorders, so people who, their body is there, but they think it's not. There's the alien limb, so the arm is real, but the person has the feeling that that's not their arm. And they confabulate tremendously to explain why the arm is nevertheless attached to their body, why when they get up to go to the loo does the arm come with them. I mean, there's really deep depersonalization disorders that happen as a result of brain injury. So I think one of the ways that I think about it is if that happens in brain injury, and these disorders, at least minor versions of them, are more common than you would think. I mean, they're minor versions of these things.
We all have a little bit of it.
We all have a little bit, and that just gives me the feeling that maybe the sense of self, the sense of who we are, is really fragile.
For all of us, I mean, not just when there's a disorder, but wouldn't you say for all of us, we're not actually sure
absolutely.
Who we are.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's right.
There is a sense of fragility or uncertainty there.
And I think that's because the way we actually live in our body is very flexible.
I see.
I don't want to say fragile. It's very flexible, and that this happens to everyone here. It's the reason that human beings are so good at using tools, for example. The reason we're good at using tools is whenever we pick up a thing, we have the ability to incorporate that thing into what's called the body schema. Okay. The body schema is like, you can think of it like a map. So one way, I think that the intuitive way that a lot of people think that the brain controls the body is like a marionette. So you've got a neuron in your head that twitches your finger. You twitch that neuron and it twitches the finger, right? I mean, that's kind of like the intuitive sense that we're connected up with this wiring in this sort of mechanical way. But that's very much not true. I mean, the brain flexibly invents a body and then uses that invention, that fiction of the body, to inhabit the body.
Okay. I mean, we've had this discussion many times around the question, is the mind in the body? I mean, that's the general way of looking at it, the brain. So is the mind in the body, or is the body in the mind?
Yeah.
Because from the Buddhist perspective, we are aware, we are conscious, we are experiencing our own body. So in that sense, the body is a projection of the mind. So that the brain is also a projection of consciousness. So is the mind in the body, is the body in the mind? We talk about this endlessly, and we love arguing about it.
My job depends on there being an actual brain.
Okay, so I'm trying to take your job away.
I'm pretty dedicated to that point of view. But look, we can do a little experiment here to show the flexibility of the body representation. So if everyone here, if you can turn to the person next to you and pair up, we need everybody in pairs. You can pick. One of you will be a scientist, and one of you will be the subject. Now,
did you bring scalpels? Because this is going to get really messy.
So I'll be the scientist, Thubten will be the subject. But the scientist, if you're stuck, those of you who've chosen to be the scientist, you can do multiple subjects. So you just need one person who's a scientist and then one person who's a subject. So is everybody basically in pairs or something like a group? Okay, so what you do, I want you to take your hands and point your thumbs down with the backs of your hands, the subjects, not the scientists. The subjects, I want you to point your thumbs down with the back of your hands next to each other. Okay? Now, cross your arms over, whatever way you like, and interdigitate your hands. So thumbs are down and hands are interdigitated.
What does it mean linked?
Clasp your hands. I don't know. What do you say? Clasp your hand. It's interdigitation.
Linked. Clasped.
Linked. All right.
Talking.
All right. So look, they've understood. Look, they're all doing it. So you got your thumbs down. Now, this is the tricky maneuver, and I'm not taking any medical responsibility for injuries that occur.
Oh, here we go.
You turn your thumbs up.
I've just broken my arms.
You have not. Okay? You got it?
Yeah, I've got it.
Now, you can name whatever finger you like. What I would like the scientist to do is now point at the subject and say, move that finger. You point to any finger you like.
Oh, interesting.
Try it a couple times.
Interesting. Okay.
Yeah? So what you're noticing...
It's not easy.
It's not easy.
Try again. Let's do another one.
Okay, like move that finger over there. That middle one. It's slow, right?
It takes a moment to realize what you're supposed to do.
Yeah. Okay, now it gets a little bit easier if I touch it. Still not that easy.
It's like you go blank. You're not sure what finger you're
Isn't it interesting?
dealing with.
It's completely interesting.
Is everyone doing it?
I think it sounds like everyone, there's a lot of O's and O's. I mean, the interesting thing about this little, it's such a trivial manipulation, this thing. And the interesting thing about that is that your brain becomes confused about where your fingers are. I mean, instantly. It's not something that happens after a stroke. It's not something that happens after training. It's instant. And what that means to me as a neuroscientist is that at any single moment, the body representation is completely fluid.
Yeah.
It can be changed and confused by the most simple thing with no preparation and nothing dramatic. I mean, now imagine that happens to you. It's going to happen more when you're tired. It's going to happen more when you've had a few drinks or whatever. So this sense that we live in a body which is constant is, I think, an illusion. The brain is, I agree with you in that sense. I mean, I think the brain is creating a body.
And would you say a brain is creating the world as well? The world around us?
I think that...
I mean, we're looking at the world through our particular perception.
Yeah.
Is the world in our perception?
Right. So do you know, there was Plato wrote about the allegory of the cave.
Tell us.
Okay, so basically, I mean, a lot of you will probably be familiar with this idea. So Plato, in the Republic, he writes about this idea that you imagine there were prisoners. It sounds really grim, but it's a different world back then.
Not as bad as my one about chopping up the body.
Nobody gets chopped up in this story. So they're prisoners. They're chained to the back of a cave, and they're unable to look in any direction. So they're forced to look at the back wall of this cave. Now, the only light that gets into the cave is through. It's actually in Plato's version of the story. There's a fire behind the prisoners, and there's a wall. Half a wall, like a sort of half-height wall between the fire and the prisoners. So the prisoners see this flickering light cast onto the back wall of the cave. Now, the prisoners have been chained in this cave since birth. They've never had any experience of any reality other than the back wall of the cave. And what they see on the back wall of the cave is once in a while, people will walk between the fire and the wall. So they'll see little things sticking up over the wall. So sometimes they'll see the head of a spear. Sometimes they'll see a bow. Sometimes they'll see someone's hair. And they hear voices. So they hear things going on the other side of the wall. Obviously, they're going to attribute the voices to the shadows that they're seeing. Right? They see the person with the spear. They recognize, we saw the spear thing yesterday. It had the same voice. It had a deep, resonant voice. We saw the curly hair. It had a shriller voice. So Plato says that these prisoners will develop a sense that what is real is these shadows. They won't be aware in any sense that there's a reality that's creating the shadows, because to know that, you would have to know that there was a wall and a fire. You'd have to know all of these things that the prisoners couldn't possibly know. And so the argument is that the brain is like that. The brain is trapped in this cave of the skull. The only way the brain gets information is through shadowy sensory inputs. The brain doesn't directly experience the world. The world is mediated through sensation.
So we are prisoners of our perception.
Yeah, I think so.
And there's a similar sort of allegory in Buddhist thinking where we talk about, for example, looking at a person looking at a pond, a lake. A person standing at the side of a lake. You, as the person, are experiencing a lake, a piece of water. But a fish inside the water is, of course, experiencing a completely different reality. Right. They're experiencing air that they breathe. In fact, it's their whole world. So the person sees it as water. The fish experiences it as their entire universe made of air. Who is right? I mean, who is having a genuine experience? Yeah. They're having alternate experiences because they are prisoners of their particular perception. Neither are correct in a way.
Yeah.
It is an illusion cooked up by perception.
And you told me that story about the fish the other day. It's really interesting because one of the things that you convinced me of is that when we talk about sensory knowledge of the world, like I know that something is water. How do I know that something is water? I know it's water because it's wet, because I can drink it, because it reflects light in a certain way, because it has a density, it has properties, right? As a scientist, I say this thing is water because it has properties which can be defined. And I think your story really nicely illustrates that for the fish scientist, there will be a wholly different set of properties. The properties of water will be a completely different sort of description. So I think we can say that the description of the nature of reality is dependent on our perspective in that way. I think that is what's happening in the brain. I mean, but what's interesting, so there's been, I would say there's been a big shift in the way neuroscientists think about sensation. And for most of the history of neuroscience, which is, admittedly a relatively young field, but I would say most of the history of neuroscience and the psychology of perception, we've sort of thought that perception works in what I call a bottom-up way. So I'm looking out at all of you. The way that my brain understands what's going on, the classical understanding is that first I see essential properties, like I see color, I see form, I see shadow, I see texture, maybe I see motion, I might see contrast. There's visual primitives. There's basic properties in the visual scene, and what happens is that my brain combines those basic properties like a puzzle to say that, okay, well then this must be the sensory perception because it's got these properties, right? So the real revolution, and this work is being done by some of my former colleagues at Queen Square, Carl Friston and Chris Frith, is on this. There's an idea of predictive coding. And the idea there is that sensory information is very low quality. So it's very subject to noise. So in order to actually have an experience of reality, the brain has to generate a prediction. It generates a model. What do I think I'm going to see? Okay, I see red, I see robes, I see these shapes, but I also think that that's likely to be my friend Thubten. And the idea is that the thought that it's likely to be my friend Thubten actually comes first. And then the sensory input is interpreted in light of that pre-existing concept. Without the pre-existing concept, there is no sensory input. So you actually literally don't see things. And we see this all the time. When you hear about the police interviewing eyewitnesses, they very much report that they have absolutely seen, for example, things that they couldn't possibly have seen. They weren't standing in a place where they could have seen the thing they said they saw. And they're not making it up. It's actually their experience of reality that they've seen this thing. The concepts come before the sensation.
So in that sense, we could say that this reality is an illusion, but if somebody throws a brick at your head, you're going to feel it.
It's going to hurt.
It's going to hurt.
Yeah.
You know. So in the one sense, you could say yes, it's not an illusion. But from the point of view of the perceiver, if a brick falls on my head, sure, I'm going to feel it. I mean, sometimes I wonder if advanced meditators, of which I am not one, but advanced meditators maybe have more of a spacious understanding of reality and they don't react so much. Maybe a brick could fall on their head and they wouldn't feel it because they don't believe that the brick exists. I don't know.
That would be amazing. So
perspective,
you think that you could chuck a brick at your teacher's head?
I imagine so. I'd rather not, but I imagine. I think the advanced meditators have more of a spacious awareness and they're reacting less because they take things as being less solid.
Yeah.
But for us, things are solid. If I punch you, you're going to feel it. You're going to punch me back.
Oh yeah, at least that. But you know, look, it's interesting. It's interesting because so I've got a 10-year-old. You know, Kiran, and he has this interesting thing where everybody who has kids has had this experience. Like he'll go out and play. I remember he's playing and he got cut, and he came into the house and his knee, there's like blood streaming down his knee, and he didn't notice. And I said to him, Kiran, what happened? And he looks down and he starts crying, but he had no experience. You know, until his attention was drawn to it. I mean, so what I'm thinking is that there must have been a moment at which he was actually genuinely wounded.
Yeah.
There will have been, you know, there's A delta fibers in the leg that carry the sensation of pain to the brain. Those fibers are triggered by mechanical injury. They're not triggered by consciousness or intention or will. They're triggered by mechanical injury. So the information about the wound came into the brain. For sure, the information about the wound came into the brain. But it didn't enter into Kiran's reality, even though it was present in the brain. And that's this kind of idea of sensory gating. So even when we think, you know, like your teacher would feel the brick, it seems crazy to think that you could tune out.
Tune out, or maybe I don't know, maybe if we kind of believed our stories a bit less, we'd be better off. I don't know. I'll tell you a funny story about this. I run some meditation centers, and in one of those centers, there was somebody in the center who really didn't like me and had lots of problems with me. Later we talked about it, and she said she always has issues around anyone in a kind of authority situation.
Oh, yeah.
So there were all these very kind of aggressive emails coming from her.
You were in charge
me.
of the center.
Yeah,
oh, okay.
and I was struggling with this. Like, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with Julie and her nasty emails? What do I do? I said to my teacher, you know, I'm getting all of this, what do I do? And he just looked at me and said, you've got to just realize that Julie doesn't exist.
There you go, that's the solution. Julie doesn't exist, that's it?
I mean, that's going to the ultimate level, isn't it?
That's tough.
But maybe if we believed those stories less, realized that they are actually in our heads, maybe that would help.
Yeah.
But then there's another aspect to this, which is that it kind of sounds as if we're talking about a sort of nihilistic, amoral universe where nothing's there, so it doesn't matter. But I don't think that's true. I think from maybe an ultimate perspective, you could say that, but from our point of view as perceivers stuck in this delusion, we are experiencing stuff and people are suffering. There is pain, and that pain is real to the person in pain. So in Buddhism, this is where there's a place for compassion. You can't just say, well, nothing exists, so it doesn't matter. We have to exist within the duality of how we think and how we perceive and try to help each other and try to train in compassion.
But why? So why, though? I mean, it sounds great. It sounds, but what I don't understand is, so you have this notion that there's suffering in the world.
Yeah.
Why do you have to do something about that? Like, why is that? You know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
because for you, you said this to me before, compassion becomes the mandate. Compassion becomes the reason for all action.
But again, there needs to be some kind of investigation here. So the thing I love about Buddhism is when Buddha gave all of his teachings, at the end of it, he said, don't believe a word I say.
Yeah.
Check it for yourselves. And so when you do compassion practice, the first stage is actually to investigate, is there any point in this? Is there a reason for compassion? And you do these kind of internal examinations where you investigate, well, what about the selfish mind, the self-centered mind, versus the compassionate mind? How do those two minds feel? Which state of mind feels better for oneself or for others? Which has more benefit? Which has less benefit? You kind of prove to yourself why compassion is healthy for you and healthy for others. And then based on that finding from your internal research, you'll want to develop it as a trainable skill.
Well, that's an interesting way to think about it. I mean, there's research, excellent research that's coming out of what Chris Lamb and Tanya Singer have done work on compassion and empathy in contrast to empathy.
So not just a feeling, but something else.
So I think, and this is something that I think a lot of times it's hard to distinguish between empathy and compassion.
Yeah. So I think empathy is a feeling, somebody's suffering, and you once talked about this as a kind of mirroring experience. People are in pain, now I'm in pain. That would be empathy?
Yes, I think that's right. It's also, I think empathy is it's understanding the emotional life of someone else.
But now you're experiencing it too.
Right, so you can experience it by modeling. I mean, one of the things that Chris Lamb writes about is this interesting idea that you can use empathy to wound people.
Oh.
You know, like if I understand in detail how Thubten feels, I can use that to manipulate him.
I see.
That knowledge, that insight. And you often see this with people who, I mean, we all know people who are very, very good at predicting how someone else is feeling, predicting how they respond to information, and they can use that to their advantage. So I think empathy doesn't necessarily imply a good thing.
Okay.
Empathy can just mean that you really understand someone else's mental state. It doesn't mean that you're moved by that in any way.
So I think compassion has a deeper quality to it, where it's a training in the skill of wanting to be of benefit to others, wanting to help others, and then that intention becomes an action. There are actually three elements. You can boil down compassion training to three elements. There's the element of intention, which means that every time you meditate, you set the intention, I'm doing this for the benefit of other sentient beings.
You say this to yourself.
You kind of say this to yourself. So when I meditate, I start and end each session with a moment of setting the intention of compassion. So I would say to myself, I'm not just doing this for me, I'm doing this for others. Which means as I'm meditating so that I can develop the skills through which I could help others. So the intention will naturally become a habit, which becomes action. So intention is one thing. The other thing is that in the meditation itself, you're learning compassion because you're learning how to forgive your own thoughts. I think that's the key. You know, when you're meditating and a thought comes and you learn just to leave it alone, not sort of try to push it away or judge it, but just come back to the breath, you are developing an unconditional acceptance of your own mind. You're just leaving things alone. You're not judging them. You're not saying, I'm bad for having this thought. This emotion is bad. There's something wrong with me. You're just leaving it alone. This is compassion within your own mind, less judgment. And that enables you to have less judgment towards others. So when others hurt you or when others are behaving in a way you can't understand, you've understood the human condition within yourself, and that gives you a sort of compassion towards others.
Right.
And then the third thing is that meditation anyway, in all its forms, is going to reduce that ego within us. It's going to help us to see through that delusion of ego so that our compassion can start to breathe. It's almost as if we've imprisoned ourselves in this sense of self, and that's kept us very cut off. And the meditation is dissolving the bars of those prisons so that we can feel more connected to others.
I mean, it's very, I just want to talk about each of those.
Okay.
Because the neuroscience of each of them is, I think, quite different. And it's surprising in a way that for you, that's all bound up in this one word, compassion.
Yeah.
So to me, I would suppose naively, I would think of those as very different things. But the first one you said, intention. I mean, what's surprising is the brain has an absolute overlap between intention to act and action.
Yeah.
You know, some of you may have heard of these studies of like tennis players. This happens when people train for sports. So you can play tennis by actually doing forehands and backhands, but you can also very carefully imagine doing a forehand or a backhand. And as it turns out, there's really interesting evidence that the brain is almost enacting that. So the parts of the brain that become active when you're going to do a forehand are different to the parts of the brain that would become active when you do a backhand, and you can tell the difference in neuroimaging and in using a technique called TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation. So I can tell you that your brain is preparing to act in one way or the other way, based on what you're imagining.
So you can train that intentional aspect.
Well, anytime,
tuning it up.
Exactly, and anytime you have the intentional aspect, it's sort of more than halfway to actually doing the thing.
Interesting.
So Tanya Singer has done some interesting work on this in compassion. So why is it that compassion, one of the things that I think many of us who've studied this data know is that for some reason, compassion training dramatically changes the brain, much more than just normal meditation or mindfulness. Like when you add this compassion component, the change is pretty profound. And so one of the big changes that you see is that when you do compassion training, you get a lot of activation in a part of the brain called the premotor cortex. So premotor cortex is like a motor planning region. It's the region that figures out what's the group of muscles that would need to be active in order to achieve this target, to achieve a goal. And so when you say to yourself, okay, I'm meditating for the benefit of others, it's almost, you're recruiting the part of your brain that plans action. And when you recruit that part of the brain over and over, it actually becomes more likely that that part of the brain will become activated. So it means you're actually more likely to do an action because you've mentally rehearsed doing an action. So I can get intention. I can get why intention has to do with compassion. And then you said phase 2 was...
learning to accept yourself. And then that helps you to accept others.
Acceptance, okay.
And
then
phase 3 was the meditation itself is helping us to dissolve that sense of self, that ego that keeps us held in.
Yeah. Okay, so talk more about that. Why? So first of all, that sounds kind of, it sounds a little bit maybe counterintuitive to me. Like, why do we need to dissolve the ego to be compassionate towards others? Because one of the things that I think, like traditionally you're taught is, do unto others as you would do unto yourself. So you sort of think about what would I like in that situation, and then I should treat you the way I would like to be treated.
Well, in,
right?
in Buddhism, we don't actually talk about dissolving the ego as if we're trying to break something down. The Buddhist understanding is that the ego is not even there. It's a delusion. So we want to see through this delusion of ego. And it's this sense of egocentricity and self that keeps us from connecting with others. We are all interdependent. Everything depends on everything else. Everybody depends on everything else. And we don't see that when we're stuck in a self-centered way of thinking. So when we can move beyond ego, we can discover the connectivity that we all have with others, and the natural response to that connectivity is compassion. And also, as the ego delusion starts to melt, we will discover within ourselves the natural... In Buddhism, they talk about Buddha nature, which is the natural ultimate mind that's within us, which has all the qualities of compassion.
And I think it's very interesting, this use of the word nature. I would say that quite a lot of Western science, a lot of my training, is certainly based on this idea that the natural world is extremely competitive.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And this was, Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century wrote that the natural state of man is nasty, brutish, and short, which later people said, well, Thomas Hobbes must have been nasty, brutish, and short. But I think it's an interesting thing. I think a lot of, if you talk to people in the business world, look, even if you talk to people in the medical world, I would say that there's a general sense that life is competitive, that it's a little bit every man for himself, that this is the natural state of the world, and that when we impose compassion or morality or some type of love, that this is nice, it's great, it feels wonderful, but it's not the natural state of the world.
I don't agree. I don't think that we are naturally fight or flight killing machines. I think that's a sort of delusion that we fall into, and in fact it's promoted by the culture around us. Yeah. In that for this consumerism to keep rolling, the wheels to keep turning, we have to be fooled into constantly competing and constantly coming from a place of ego. If we came from a place of purity and compassion, we kind of wouldn't go shopping.
Yeah.
This structure that we inhabit would collapse. So we are tricked by all of the inputs around us into thinking of the self all the time, but it just makes us more unhappy.
I think that's true, and it's an interesting model that, I grew up in Ohio, in America, in a manufacturing town, and one of the things that was really obvious to politicians in Ohio in the 1950s was that automobiles were they lasted a long time. Like at that point, they were pretty well built. You could keep them going. The local mechanic could keep them going a long time. And one of the founders of our town, Charles Kettering, said the only way that the automobile industry will survive is to figure out a way to make a person dissatisfied with their car.
Yeah.
Because the car's not going to break down. So that means there has to be a change in fashion, or there has to be something about the new model that makes a person want to get rid of the old model. So I do think that creating dissatisfaction is at the heart of consumption. We have to create dissatisfaction to drive industry.
And getting people further and further away from that essence of mind that is their natural state.
Right, and so you call that the Buddha nature. So
Well,
what is the Buddha
I didn't
nature?
coin the phrase, but
So what does that mean?
It's chapter 2 in my book. Do you remember I gave you my I'm joking.
Pushing the book? No, I haven't read the book. He sent me the book. I have a PDF of the book.
skimmed it.
I skimmed it. It's great.
Okay,
it's a great book.
so I think
It's well written.
I think
the first page was really well written.
I think the first page. I think the way this is described in Buddhism is that we have this potential for awakening within us, and that's why we meditate, because we have the potential for awakening. And the steps towards that in Buddhism are to start to identify more with one's own awareness. There's a purity of awareness that we all have, or everybody has. We're all aware, aren't we? We know what we're thinking, we know what we're feeling. There's that knowingness in the mind. For example, anytime you get angry or sad or upset, if you know that you're angry, there's a part of you that knows you're angry. That part that's seeing the anger, that part is not angry. That part is beyond the anger. The awareness, the experience of the mind is able to see the problem. And I think Buddhism is very much about connecting with that backdrop of awareness, which is pure and unpolluted. And through meditation, we're getting closer to that. And that is where compassion lies.
You have a really lovely analogy about the ocean, I think.
Yeah, I
right?
talk a lot, in Buddhist meditation texts, they talk a lot about the ocean and the waves. Our thoughts, our emotions, our pain, our suffering, a little bit like waves on an ocean, and we're kind of being thrown about by those waves. But say you are in the ocean and you dive down beneath the waves and you're under the water. Under the surface, it's still, it's spacious, there's nothing going on, it's peace. It's when we're caught up in the surface that's the problem. So the awareness is more like the under the water, the spaciousness. The ocean naturally has the waves, but there's more to it than just waves.
You know, and I think in terms of how neuroscientists think about, I mean, that's such a beautiful analogy, I think, that the true nature of the ocean is the depth, and the superficial nature is the surface, and yet when we think about the ocean, we have usually, for those of us who, are not oceanographers, I mean, we think about the surface as the relevant part. And I think, so David Chalmers, in the I'm not going to forget when Chalmers was writing, but Chalmers describes two problems of consciousness. He describes an easy problem and a hard problem. And which I think always worries neurologists, because what Chalmers describes as the easy problem is what my entire career is trying to figure out. So what Chalmers basically says that the easy problem of consciousness is all of the mechanical things that the brain does. So behavior and perception and thinking and feeling and talking and all of the things that you could imagine. There will be someone here today who will someday be able to create a robot that can do all of the mechanical things that can appear in all physical ways like a human being. So Chalmers says this is the easy problem. Essentially, there will be a mechanical reason, a very mechanical, rational reason, why the brain is able to produce the full array of human behaviors. Okay, so you can imagine a robot, or Chalmers sort of said a zombie could do that. The hard problem of consciousness is the feeling of awareness. Why is it that we do all these behaviors, but we also feel that there's an ocean beneath the surface? So I would say the hard problem is the surface of the ocean. The easy problem is the surface of the ocean, and the hard problem is all of that stuff underneath, all of the stuff that we don't see, but we feel that when we introspect, when we go deep into ourselves, we feel there is this strong sense of personhood there, a strong sense of self.
Well, I would say two things about that. The first thing I would say is that depth that we can sort of experience through meditation, that awareness, that eventually the realization of what the mind is, what has that got to do with compassion? I think it's simply that if we understand that everybody's caught up in the waves and doesn't understand the depth, there would be an impulse, we want to wake up so that we can help others to wake up. Compassion would come naturally because of feeling that the suffering we all experience is kind of unnecessary because we don't understand the depth of the mind. So there would be this impulse, I want to work on my mind to wake up from this so that I can help others. But that has to be an experiential thing rather than a conceptual thought process. I mean, this is kind of where we differ. This love affair
ends?
This is kind of where it ends. Because there has to come a point where we go beyond concept. It's almost as if we're trying to... No, we
don't.
Yes, we do. Because it's as if we're trying to understand the non-conceptual using concepts.
So you think in principle science couldn't understand that?
No.
That's it. The love affair is over.
It's over.
There was a love affair between Buddhists and neuroscientists, and we're getting a divorce now.
We go a certain way together, and then the Buddhist approach would be, well, ultimately one has to go beyond concept and experience the truth directly, not through thought. Okay. Thought can only take us a certain way. A philosophy, a science is only good as its latest discovery.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of discoveries.
So this is where we get to...
We have to split up.
We can still be pals.
I don't know about that.
We love each other.
Fine.
Okay, look, let's talk, just to end, let's talk very specifically about, let's look at this practically. What is compassion meditation? I think I'd like to end by just doing a short, so we can make up.
Okay.
Compassion meditation. So earlier we did meditation with the breathing, now we're going to do meditation with compassion. Okay, so sit up nice and straight, and just be present with your body, feel the chair under your body, maybe feel the breathing a little bit, just be in that moment with body and mind. Try to establish the wish or the intention, may I develop kindness and compassion towards myself and towards all other sentient beings. Imagine that in the center of your body, in the center of, around the level of your heart, but in the center of your chest, there's a ball of light, a glowing ball of light, and try to connect with a feeling that this is your inherent compassion. This is the innate compassion that is our ultimate state, our ultimate nature, our deeper mind, is compassion and kindness, symbolized by a ball of light. And imagine that this light is glowing and radiating and filling up your body, with a sense of kindness, gentleness, peace, acceptance, and compassion. The light is filling you up with those qualities. Now the light is expanding out of your body and reaching out into the room and expanding towards the others around you. And imagine that as this light reaches them, you're sending them that wish for happiness and freedom. You're sending kindness in the form of this imagined light, spreading around you and spreading throughout the city and the world, spreading to all beings. The light just spreads in all directions, filling everybody up with kindness and support as you send this love from your heart. Okay, now just let go of that and just be present with your body again for a moment. Feel the chair under you. Feel the ground under your feet. Just relax into the moment. and stop there. That was a small taste of compassion meditation, and thank you very much for your time. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. That's great.
Thank you.